Shimun, Surma Khanum, and Assyrian leadership. A very interesting topic, obscure for some, but very, very interesting. You have the picture there of the boy patriarch, Eshai Shimun, at age 12. So critical developments during this time are that there was failure, unfortunately, at the Paris Peace Conference for the Assyrians. There was high hope that maybe something is being done. This came at around the same time that the 1920 plan of Aga Boutros to repatriate Assyrians to their lands also did not materialize. This also came at a time when Malik Qambar of Jilu, whose attempted arrangements with the French and with others did not materialize as well. The Syriac Orthodox and Chaldean Catholic leaders became disillusioned with Western powers and turned their faces eastward and away from the machinations of Western powers or promises of Western powers. The British were preparing to leave Iraq. 1922 created what became Iraq in 1922 and then later 1930, but still having an economic hold on Iraq. And this left the Assyrians in a very uneasy existence, not knowing exactly what is going to happen to them. What is their status? Now, this is where leadership comes in, and it's important to know this. For certain Assyrian leaders, and leaders can be heads of families, they can be heads of tribes, they can be heads of churches, they can be heads of villages, they can be patriarchs, and so on. For some leaders, it was important to simply focus on your small group, whether it's your family, and certainly that was the case for many Assyrians. Let me just take care of my family. The tribe, let's just look after our tribe. We don't really want to bother with anyone else. The church, I'm a bishop or I'm a patriarch and I just care for my people within my church. And others who had grand plans for the entirety of the Assyrian nation. So for example, at the Paris Peace Conference, people like Reverend Yuval Warda, Captain or Major A.K. Yusuf, a member of the Syriac Orthodox Church. Reverend Yuval Warda was a member of the Presbyterian or Protestant faith, and others, and we will allude to others, Surma Khanum, Shimun, and others, Aga Boutros, who really tried to bring about a solution for the entirety of the Assyrian nation. They did not quite have the power on the ground to do that. The power on the ground really lay with either the regional powers or, more importantly, with these international Western powers at the time. The Russians had withdrawn, but certainly the French and the British were heavily involved in the Middle East, as were, of course, the interests of more powerful and armed parties who had the ability to veto something violently. They had arms and they had numbers. So the Arabs, for example, various Kurdish tribes, the Turkish government, and others. The Assyrians, unfortunately, fell into a category where they had been the most powerful element of the Assyrians had been the Hakkari, fell into a situation where they were away from their homes, from their lands, away from their churches, their villages, and they were the most active element within the Assyrian nation looking for a permanent solution. So, for example, if you were an Assyrian living in Telkepe at this time and your life wasn't disrupted, you could look with much sympathy towards your brothers in the Hakkari, but your life was going forward okay, so it didn't really concern you to see an overall solution. Would have been nice, as we'll see, the Chaldean Patriarch originally agreed this was a great plan if we have our own independent nation. The bishop within the Syriac Orthodox Church agreed wouldn't it be great to have an Assyria, for example, in the Paris Peace Conference? But when push came to shove, when there was the possibility of violence, and this is what we discussed earlier when we talked about the Somalia massacre, when that threat of violence became real, a lot of these leaders became very frightened and withdrew their vision for the entirety of their people into much smaller and segmented visions. Now, in the grand scheme of things, we hear oftentimes Assyrians talk about, well, they'll say things like Mosul, should have been promised to us or was promised to us. Was this really seriously considered by the great powers? We have to look at what power means and what the policy of particular countries is. These particular great powers. Great powers do not have sympathy for anyone. Great powers are like computers. You give the right input, you get the proper output. They're not run like human beings who have sympathies for people. But the Assyrians, in their give and take with various officials, as you'll see, keep this in mind as we go through the various ventures to try to find a solution for the Assyrian plight. The Assyrians considered the words of lesser officials, for example, oftentimes, and considered the perceived sympathies, for example, of the British because they were Christian, and the French because they were Christian Catholics, and so on, to be sympathetic. And of course, on the ground, there was that kind of sympathy, that kind of understanding, that kind of empathy on the part of British officials, and even French officials, and Russian officials. But it certainly was not their policy. It certainly was not their policy. In terms of these great powers and what they wanted to do, as the British would often say, England has no friends, it has interests. And of course, this is across the board for all of these powers. Great powers like the United States, like England, do not have sympathy, they have interests. And so it's very important to remember that as we look back into Assyrian history, as we try to figure out what happened exactly. Where was the misunderstanding? Where was the where were the errors made? Who made the errors, and why? Were there promises made to the Assyrians? Did the Assyrians understand those promises? So who were the Assyrian leaders? As we said, excuse me, patriarchs and bishops played an important role in being leaders within their communities. Religious figures were very important and oftentimes took a both spiritual and temporal position. Shimun, historically in the Hakkari, was the leader and the head of the tribes who were armed and ready to go to war oftentimes, as we heard about Shimun, for example, engaging in warfare, leading over 10,000 Assyrians to a Kurdish onslaught of Ahmadiyya to try to recover, in one particular example, and others. Surma Khanum, a lady of the Bet Shimun house, who was a very prominent person, a very educated person. She also took a leadership role, kind of a de facto rather than a de jure, so less official, but a very important one nevertheless. There were among the Assyrians Maliks, traditional chiefs, although slowly over time, their role became less important, less relevant, and less consequential. So the Maliks, for example, that held sway in Tiari and Jilu and Baz and other places, because of the undermining of their economic power base that used to exist. And we're talking about agricultural societies, their ownership of either the means of production, as it were, or the labor that existed in their particular villages and districts. As that eroded, as it went away, they became less and less relevant, and their positions became ceremonial over time. Professionals such as Binyamin Ersanis, Dr. Freydun Aturaya, Dr. Baba Parhat, Rabbi Naum Faiq, Dr. Ashur Yusuf in Harput, and others began to take a prominent role as educators. They were not the traditional leaders among the Assyrians. Traditional leaders, as we said, were primarily religious figures going back into the past. Remember the millet system established long ago during the Sasanian Empire and later during the Islamic or Arab rule, and then during Ottoman rule. This is very important to keep in mind. There were no political parties, no organizations, secular organizations as such. So religious figures had power. And so later, when the industrial age comes into the Middle East, as westernization is developing in the Middle East, you have professionals taking on a significant role. Binyamin Ersanis, Freydun Aturaya, for example, became nationalists who led a nationalistic movement, and along with Dr. Baba Parhat formed the Assyrian Socialist Party. I would say, based on everything that we know, it was largely symbolic, did not, unfortunately, for the Assyrians, have much effect in moving the Assyrian nation towards a solution. But later, Assyrians did form organizations that became consequential and that endangered their lives. For example, and we will talk about these, the Assyrian Universal Alliance, the Assyrian Democratic Movement, the Assyrian Democratic Organization, personalities such as Shukri Charmukli in Syria, who was an Assyrian nationalist in the 1950s, forming the Assyrian Democratic Organization, and so on. So it is often thought for the Assyrian leaders, what went wrong? And we have here a statement, because oftentimes it is thought that promises were made, and it's a question of how to interpret those promises. And so oftentimes much time is spent by the Assyrians saying, well, there was a promise made. But the question always should be, okay, if a promise was made, such as, for example, by Captain Gracie to the Assyrians, who came to Urmia and made a promise, according to this one French head doctor of the French ambulance in the Caucasus, who happened to be in Urmia. At the behest of Agha Patros, he gives his statement and says, Captain Gracie came from Van to Urmia and there called a special meeting at the English mission for the purpose of exhorting the Assyrian Chaldean people, or Assyro-Chaldean people, to take up arms against the Germano-Turks, against the Ottomans, in other words, and their supporters. Captain Gracie solemnly promised the Assyro-Chaldean people, if they took up arms, that he would give them political support. Also, military and financial aid during the hostilities. He permitted them to hope, moreover, that the final settlement of the Treaty of Peace, the question of their independence, would be seriously considered. So there's a lot. Looking at that as an attorney, there's a lot in that statement. First of all, who is Captain Gracie and how much power does he have? Secondly, what does he mean by political support? Thirdly, what enforcement power do the Assyrians have if the British make a promise and break it? So these are all very important questions that Assyrian leaders should have considered. And let's look to see if the Assyrians, in fact, did consider these possibilities, or this type of understanding of what a promise is. By the time of Gracie's visit to Mosul in the winter of 1925-1926, a very crucial period, Those Assyrians who remained in Iraq were disliked by Arab Iraqis who strongly resented their tendency to regard themselves as British proteges. They were also disliked because of the suspicions which emerged in the early 1920s that the French might facilitate Assyrian aims for a greater Assyria, and that was in the Jazeera area. Now, the Assyrians, of course, went along with the British because the understanding was if we work with them, they are a Christian power, and anyway, we don't have much of a choice. We've been ousted from our homeland. Many of our people have been killed. What choice do we have? Is this reliance a fair reliance on the part of many Assyrian leaders, for example, in the Paris Peace Conference and later? We also have many Assyrians like Captain A.K. Yusuf. And by the way, it's important to remember that among the intellectuals and the professionals, many of these people were members of the Syriac Orthodox Church or Protestant or Church of the East. They all came together to understand that their nation was the Assyrian nation and it had many different components, and that the best way to solve this problem was to really look at a comprehensive solution, to seek a fully comprehensive solution, work towards a comprehensive solution for everyone, not simply for one's particular sect or denomination. So Captain Abraham Yusuf, who attended the Paris Peace Conference and wrote a lot of correspondence, wrote many letters to people in the United States, was very disillusioned in the end, not only because the great powers sort of shrugged them off and the Assyrians, but also because the Assyrians themselves had trouble putting their act together, getting their act together and showing a united front. If they had showed a united front, the chances would have been better, would have been tough to begin with. You're working with a great power, as we said, with no sympathies, only interests. But he tells us, I thought of my poor Assyrian nation. They have suffered. They have been massacred and fought with the Allies. An ongoing pattern of thinking that we had done this, therefore, but we have no one championing our cause. When I notice among Assyrians denominational and personal feelings, my heart bleeds. Assyrians must unite, casting aside religious prejudices, and join under one national flag. An attempted call rallying Assyrians, but as we'll see, it is defeated in many cases because the leaders are interested in preserving what little they feel they have. And I will make reference to this specifically with regard to the Syriac Orthodox and Chaldean church leaders. Yul Warda tells us, Reverend Yul Warda, we have the most conclusive proofs to show that the Assyrians were urged by British representatives, as you saw the reference before, of Great Britain, France, and Russia to enter into the war on the side of the Allies. With the most solemn promises of being given a free state, the Assyrians, therefore, having risked the very existence of their nation and having made such appalling sacrifices upon the altar of freedom, demand that these promises of the Allied governments now be honorably redeemed. And so, as sympathetic as we are to this statement, one must ask the question, upon what power can one demand? What power are you relying on to demand from great powers that they honorably redeem the debts paid by the Assyrians? This is a very, you have to remember, we're talking 1920 after the Great War, the First World War. And so one must question whether the assessment made by people like Reverend Yul Warda, who was an Assyrian leader in the United States, and others in the United States, persons that Dr. John Joseph accuses of being overly optimistic and not understanding really what's going on the ground, to what extent were their expectations reasonable, given not just, there's a difference, to what extent were their expectations reasonable? Surma Khanum was a very reasonable person. She did have a vision for the Assyrians, but let's see what happens to her and her expectations. She was born in Qochanos to the Marshamun family, a very great family with a very long history, located, Qochanos, on January 27th, 1883, the eldest of 8 children. Her brothers were Mar Binyamin and Mar Polis, both of whom became patriarchs of the Church of the East. She lost 4 of her younger brothers. She was the oldest: Mar Binyamin, Mar Polis, Hurmuz, and Zaya. As you know, Mar Binyamin was assassinated. Mar Polis died at age 25. Hurmuz was executed by the Turks, and Zaya died after being on the road and attempting to save his people. Surma Khanum accepted religious vows, and this is one of the reasons she is respected, in that she refused to be married and abstained, like the bishops and the Nzire, Nazarenes, if you will, people who are devoted to the church, refused to eat meat. She took a vow to devote her life to the patriarchs in this case, both of her brothers, and she was observed by various British priests and missionaries to be an exceptionally intelligent woman who assisted her brother when he became patriarch at the age of 16. Mar Binyamin in Qochanos assisted him while people were visiting the patriarch. He handled himself as a very mature person, but it was very important to have his older sister there, and she assisted with all matters and was very familiar with Assyrian the Church of the East liturgical practices and canons of her church. She was, as we said, perceived to be very intelligent in statecraft by British and Assyrians alike, and many Assyrians supported the idea that she should be the representative of the Assyrians, despite the fact that during that time, of course, women oftentimes were not in the East and the West. She was a counselor and advisor to 3 patriarchs, the third one being Mar Eshai Shimun, her nephew. She's the author of Assyrian Church Customs and the Murder of Mar Shimun, which is a very important booklet, or a book, I should say, that talks about Assyrian customs and tells the story of the murder of her brother. And here's a photograph of her with Reverend Brown, who was a part of the Archbishop of Canterbury's mission to the Assyrians. This photo is in 1897. And to the left there is Mar Binyamin Shimun as a boy, young boy. Soon after this, he is going to become patriarch at a very young age, causing, unfortunately for the Assyrians and unfortunately for the Mar Shimun family, causing a friction within the family of Mar Shimun in Qochanos. The Nimrod side of the family was very upset at the election of Mar Binyamin, and this caused consternation in Qochanos and caused a split within leadership of the church. Eventually, Nimrod was upset because his brother had been slated to become a patriarch by the previous patriarch, Marul Shimun. And when Mar Binyamin becomes patriarch, Mar Oraham Shimun, who was slated to become patriarch, becomes a member of the Chaldean church, and so does Nimrod. Yet Nimrod continues to reside, much to the consternation of Mar Shimun and the rest of the family, and eventually um, um, Nimrud, who's known as Nimrud Beg, is assassinated along with his sons and their supporters in Quchanos. And the murder is at times blamed on Mar Binyamin, but this is a mystery that no one can say with certainty, although in the book of Malik Loku, Assyrian struggle for survival, national survival, certainly the blame is laid on Mar Binyamin, as is also in the book by Malik Qambar, or about Malik Qambar, the biography of Malik Qambar, not autobiography, biography, written by Sam Parhad in the 1980s. That also lays the blame on Mar Binyamin. At any rate, not to go into too much detail here, but this led to a split, all too familiar split within the Assyrian Church of the East, which is going to have harmful consequences. Here we have Surma Khanum when she was a young girl, with Mar Binyamin, who is standing next to Mar Sargis, the bishop of Jilu, to his left, and next to him is Hormuz, who in the future is going to be executed by the Ottomans because the Assyrians have decided to join the Allies. And his brother is going to be threatened that unless he caves in to the demands of the Ottomans, his brother is going to be executed. That's where he says the famous line, "My nation is many, my brother is one. All of my nation is my brother's." And so he refuses to concede to Ottoman demands, and his brother is executed in Mosul. And that's him to the right of, to your right, wearing the hat, the white hat. Now, the claim of the Mar Shimun family to rule legitimately was something that historians often pointed to with no controversy. And Surma Khanum, in her book, says, for 400 years, these powers have been hereditary in our family, going from uncle to nephew, although always the new patriarch has been chosen and consecrated by general approval. In other words, there's a democratic process to allow this leadership to take place. It's not simply, we choose within our family and that's it. Oftentimes, Assyrians, remember now, the Assyrians in the Hakkari area were the largest segment of Assyrians compared to, for example, the Assyrians in the Nineveh plain, compared to the Assyrians in Urmia, compared to the Assyrians in Tur Abdin. In all the denominations, this was the most powerful, the largest compact entity of Assyrians. And so being a patriarch was a very important temporal position as well as spiritual position. And so the patriarch had to, before being chosen, a council took place and everyone's opinion was taken, and people of relevance, including the Mir of Hakkari, for example, and other leaders, perhaps even Turkish officials, and the tribes of the Assyrians who held sway in the Hakkari area, and other bishops. So people had to weigh in on who is going to be the next patriarch. So this position came with, in effect, an agreement. There was an agreement, as if one could say voting. This was the way people voted. People didn't go to the polls and vote. They simply expressed their opinion, and it was a matter of agreement between various relevant families and various officials that the patriarch was finally approved. And certainly the neighbors of the Assyrians had some say in it. Now, again, I want to emphasize, despite the perceived understanding of many Assyrians, Western planning did not include the Assyrians in 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, for example, during this time. It did include the Arabs. The British worked out various arrangements with the Arabs, less so with the Kurds, less so with the Armenians, but certainly completely less so with the Assyrians. So here you see a map that indicates what the French wanted, what the British wanted. A is the French, and it could have been the case that the French could have claimed Mosul. The French Catholics were active in the Mosul area, Dominican fathers and others. So there was some connection there. And certainly, Mosul was closer to Aleppo than it was to Basra, for example, in terms of culture and so on. So there was an opportunity to be able to, and this area, by the way, the French A category also contains largely Sunni Arabs, whereas the area of B and other areas contains Shia areas. So that's why you have a minority of Shia today in Iraq, whereas they are a majority in Syria, for example. So at any rate, the Assyrians were not considered in any serious way. What was important for the British was the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1922, which gave Iraqis self-government, quote unquote, while Britain controlled foreign policy and controlled important economic decisions. That was what was important for Britain. And the Iraqis were, of course, upset. The Iraqi nationalists, remember, this is the age of nationalism. By now, you also have a number of decades of Arab nationalism, started largely as a literary movement by Christians in Lebanon, Christian Arabs in Lebanon, or persons who became Arabized Christians, I should say, in Lebanon, such as Yazigi and Bustani and others. These are the peoples who started Arab nationalism in the 1800s, and this movement picked up. And by the time the British have created the mandate of Iraq, Arab nationalists were expecting much more from Britain. Certainly from their perspective, they got less, but what's important to Britain and to the rulers who were Faisal, for example, from the Hijaz, what was important was that Iraq would be under the reliable rule of certain Arabs who made a deal with Britain and who fought the Ottomans. So while Iraq had self-government, Britain would control foreign policy in Iraq. It would also control Iraq's economy. And then again, in 1930, the Second Anglo-Iraqi Treaty takes place. This time, Iraq is seen as a much more important place because by 1927, the oil is discovered, and oil is a very important commodity, as you know. I don't have to repeat that to you. You know that. So oil is very important. And so for Britain, really, oil is one of the most important things. And I'll make a reference to the song that Iwan Agassi sings, written by Givargis Agassi, the poet, who says, Dimma smuqa zubinnu b'dimma kuma. They sold the red blood, meaning of the Assyrian people, with the black blood, meaning oil, symbolic gesture. So this is perceived to be a kind of betrayal of the Assyrians by the British, who were, as I said, a great power seeking their interests. Well, Surma Khanum at this point becomes an important figure. Her status is elevated after the assassination of her brother in 1918. She takes on a greater role, even though her other brother, younger brother, becomes a patriarch at the age of 23, Marpolis. She is a dominant personality. She is a very strong personality. I once, just to kind of give you a feel for her, she was, of course, considered very, very articulate, knew a number of languages, well-read. She would read newspapers from the West. And so it was unusual, to say the least, for an Assyrian lady to be so prominent among her people during this time in the 1920s. So I once heard, so you get to know her personality. When typically Surma Khanum walked into a room, everyone stood up as a sign of respect. Um, and she was always referred to as Surma Khanum, not simply as Surma. And this one time, this one person who did not know her well, did not stand up. She made sure to reprimand them by telling them, "Do you know who I am?" And the person said, "Yes, I know who you are." And they said, "Do you understand that when I walk into a room, people stand up, whether it's men or women, they stand up out of respect. So next time, make sure you stand up." Gives you just a little bit of a flavor of the personality, at times contentious, at times difficult. But when it came to her people, Surma Khanum definitely did her best. She had a vision for her people, and she came to England and came to the United States with the intention of finding some kind of a solution. But again, keep in mind that the British were not going to act simply out of sympathy, as much as the Assyrians had the sympathy of many members of the British religious hierarchy, for example, and even the American religious hierarchy or American missionaries and others. The idea that their entire nation, their entire government would act in the interest of the Assyrians was perhaps a misplaced idea. So in 1926, Surma Khanum visited the United States to try to raise funds for her people. New York Times commented that her visit here is in interests of the Assyrians and Iraqi Christian Relief Committee, which is working to repatriate the Assyrians in that part of their mountainous homeland, ceded to them, where the new boundary was fixed. So this is when the boundary was being disputed by various Ottoman or Turkish and British governmental officials, and it was called the Brussels line. And the Assyrians, of course, did not know and did not have much say in the negotiations between the Turkish state and the British, even if there was much sympathy on the part of many Westerners. Now, Eshai Shimun comes to power as a young boy of 12, and he becomes patriarch after the death of Marpolis Shimun, who is taken ill because of malaria, because he has, after the death of his brother, he escapes the area of Urmia and comes down to Baquba, lives in the Baquba camps until he dies at the young age of 25. So Shimun does not want to become patriarch. Of course, he's a boy of 12. He simply wants to play with his friends. And he is made the patriarch because the nation, the people feel, the various tribes among the Assyrians feel that this family must give. And there's a story that was told to me by the brother of Eshai Shimun, who passed away, Sargon, known as Captain Sargon Shimun. He told me that in 1920, after the death of Marpolis, various tribesmen of the Assyrians came in the Baquba camps and told the Shimun family, told the mother of Eshai Shimun, that we must consecrate a patriarch from your family, and otherwise the balance between the tribes will be tipped in favor of, for example, one tribe versus another. The people visiting were from the tribes of Truma and Jilu, and they did not want a patriarch to come from the Tiari tribes. So the Tiari being the largest tribe of the Assyrians from the Hakkari. And so when the mother of Shimun said, "All right, no more from our family because we've given so many, let the nation find someone else," she was in effect not perhaps directly threatened, but told that there would be blood between people unless we consecrate someone from the Shimun family. It is a time of great distress, and so we need this type of stability to come again from this family. And there you see in the lower left-hand corner the boy patriarch who is being walked through the Bakuba camps in one of the most difficult situations one could be in. And he's being walked, and to his side are Markhanishu, the Metropolita of the Church of the East, with Marsargis, the Bishop of Jilu, and other priests and members of the clergy, and a whole host of Assyrians, the thousands of Assyrians that are attending the service. Now, here he is sitting with his Markhanishu Metropolitan, which is the Archbishop, in effect, in the Church of the East, and Marsargis of Jilu, the bishop, hereditary position, like Shimun, who inherited a hereditary position, who's going to be the last in this position. Marsargis remains, this position remains the last hereditary position within the Church of the East. And the Marsargis of today, of course, is seemingly the last in the line of that hereditary position in the church. Now, as we said, the Marshimuns come from a long line of leaders who were both temporal and spiritual leaders. And certainly Eshai Shimun, faced with the crisis that he was faced with, takes on a very important role at this time because of the many failed ventures, one could say, attempts at nationhood by different Assyrian parties. Shimun becomes a very important personality around whom the hopes of the Assyrian nation, regardless of the denomination, is surrounded. Now, this is despite the perhaps unattractiveness of the idea to the leadership of other rival, I shouldn't say rival, but other churches, denominations. So he's the boy patriarch in 1920. The trying or difficult years are from 1933 to 1930, to 1933. The attempts from the diaspora to do something for his people, as we will make reference to, and the shift in policy in 1948, which I will explain. And then finally, the last year is the hope and the disappointment in 1970 when he visits Iraq, and in 1975 when he is assassinated. So there was a historic conference that he called, and he called all of the leaders, the Maliks of the Assyrians, the Maliks of the Tiari, the Tkhuma, the Jilu, the Baz, all of the Assyrian Maliks. This would also include Malik Khoshaba of Lower Tiari, who had become a controversial figure for the Patriarch because he was in disagreement with the plans of the Patriarch to find a overall solution to the Assyrian plight, and to seek, rather, like other religious entities within Iraq, for example, once Iraq was settled, to seek a solution that was more narrower. So, for example, allowing Assyrians to settle in certain lands without any other demands. Shimun did not agree with this, in part because, according to Malik Yaqub in his book, this was something that all of the Assyrians agreed to. They wanted a comprehensive solution. They felt themselves to be a type of central government, if you will, for all of the Assyrians, and wanted a solution that encompassed the entirety of the Assyrian nation. So he is the only patriarch who makes this demand, that the Assyrians should be recognized as a nation domiciled in Iraq and not merely as an Iraqi religious community. This was definitely not, by the time he is asking this, definitely not the desire of the hierarchy of the Syriac Orthodox Church, of the hierarchy of the Chaldean Church, and certainly even among his own people, like, for example, Malik Khoshaba, who sought a more modest settlement with the Iraqi government, less reliance on the British. Like Surma Khanum, Eshai Shimun initially also felt that the British would be more sympathetic to the position of the Assyrians and would perhaps view the Assyrians as an opportunity to develop better relations with them. Little was understood about all of the background agreements between the British and the Iraqis and what really was the most important thing to the British interests. Now, contrary to Eshai Shimun, other Assyrian leaders, such as Patriarch Ilyas Shakir, for example, who was born in Mardin in 1867, who was educated in part by Naum Fayek, who became a prominent Assyrian nationalist, became the Patriarch in 1916 and was confirmed in 1919. He initially obtained promises from the Sultan, although to a limited extent, for the Assyrians of southeastern Turkey, what became southeastern Turkey, but these promises were not fulfilled because the Turkish situation changed. And so, whereas in the past he was interested in even a narrower solution for his people, when confronted by Ataturk, the leader of Turkey, the nationalist leader of Turkey, along with the Armenian Patriarch and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, when they sat together, Ataturk asked, "What do you want?" The Armenian Patriarch asked for lands to be returned to his people, and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch asked for the same. The answer, according to a person who knew the Patriarch, the answer that he gave was, "I have only two words to say: we are Turks, and Turks we shall remain." So any kind of hope expressed by, for example, the aspirations of Marshamun that we be recognized as a nation within Iraq or anywhere else was given up, certainly by Patriarch Ilyas Shakir. And the same is true by the patriarch that followed him, whereas he before advocated for the creation of an entity called Assyria, participated in the in the Paris Peace Conference. He also changed his mind, became a supporter of Arab nationalism later, and became even, one could say, anti-Assyrian in his sentiments, and wanted nothing to do with Assyrian nationalism, saying after Semele that, look what this nationalism got, our brothers in the Church of the East, we don't want any part of this. We just want to be left alone. So we will ask for simpler things. We will be more, quote unquote, reasonable with the government that rules over us. The Chaldean Patriarch, along with the Syriac Orthodox entities, bishops, and the Patriarch, initially wanted a homeland, initially expressed a desire for an Assyrian homeland, or a Syro-Chaldean homeland, as it would be called, possibly. After it became apparent that the West cannot promise any solution, or that there was absolutely no hope, he sought simply integration within the country, and even in some cases assimilation, advocating for maintaining of the Christianity among our people, less so their ethnic status or their ethnic background. That became much less important to the hierarchy of the Church of the Chaldean Church, Chaldean Catholic Church. And that has changed somewhat today, but I'm going to refer to that at a later time. Now, Marshamun, to the very last, as it were, tried to do something for his people. So when the gathering took place for the United Nations, he felt one more time, just like the Assyrian nationalist leaders during the time of the Paris Peace Conference felt that there's something happening. Perhaps we may be able to do something, much to the consternation of other church leaders who were his friends, according to a number of scholars. For example, the Archbishop of Canterbury, they just basically shook their heads and said, you're in over your head here. You're not going to get this. But he tells us the Assyrians are a people who existed in the Middle East from the dawn of history. Assyria is their home, and by reasons of history, they have an undisputed right to their survival as a people in that home. You can almost hear the echoes of Freydun Aturaya and Benjamin Arsanis and other nationalist leaders in Urmia during those early years when Assyrian nationalism was forming. Certainly not something that you would hear from other church leaders and even other Assyrian individuals who had managed to accept their plight in Iraq, particularly after the Semele massacre. But try as he did, Eshai Shimun decided that because he cannot, because the demand was too much, and he became disillusioned. He began in 1948 to shift his policy and to begin a new policy, which was simply to go back to becoming a member of these Middle Eastern governments and to kind of give up organizing oneself and to give this type of an effort to others. Perhaps, others may be able to do something, but certainly it was no longer the task of Eshai Shimun. And when he went to Baghdad, there was the understanding that perhaps Shimun would do something for the Assyrians. And we will talk about this the next time when we talk about the great hope, the rise in hope of the Assyrians, and whether Shimun's position at the point that he resigned was a more reasonable one, more accommodating one, or whether he had kind of given up the nationalist aspirations that he once had in the 1940s.